Good morning and welcome to Becky's Bible Thoughts. Thank you so much for joining me here today. Have you ever found when you're reading through the Bible that a theme sometimes develops in the verses that jump out at you? On Friday's video last week, I talked about those times when it feels a bit like we're walking through seasons of darkness. And yet all the time knowing that we can put our trust in God and absolutely rely on Him. But almost immediately after reading the verse that inspired that particular video, I found this one jumping out at me from 2 Corinthians chapter 1. It's verses 8 and 9. And it says, "We were crushed and overwhelmed beyond our ability to endure, and we thought we would never live through it. In fact, we expected to die. But as a result, we stopped relying on ourselves and learned to rely only on God who raises the dead." Paul was describing a time when he and his traveling buddies were in Asia, when they met with some pretty serious trouble and were very, very much at risk of losing their lives. It was a hard time, a dangerous time, a time that was beyond Paul, this super apostle's ability to endure. Later in 2 Corinthians, in chapter 4 and verse 8, Paul talks about being hard pressed on every side but not crushed. And yet here, he was saying that he was absolutely crushed and overwhelmed to the point that he simply could not keep going anymore. Now, we may not have been in exactly Paul's position here, fearing for our lives, but I'm sure that we've all had moments that have felt utterly overwhelming. Moments where we've sat down and said, "This is just too much for me. I can't get through this. I'm not strong enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not clever enough or talented enough or experienced enough or educated enough." There is always a moment when we realize that we are simply not enough. And this completely contradicts the saying that you often hear in Christian circles, maybe you've heard it before, that God will never give you more than you can handle. It's something that I've heard a lot of people say, and it's actually a misquote from the Bible. There's a verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 that tells us that we will never be tempted beyond what we can bear. It does not say that we will never face circumstances that are more than we can handle. That appears nowhere in the Bible. In fact, I'd say that as you read through the pages of this particular book, you'll see that the opposite is quite often the case. He will frequently give us more than we are able to endure. We often end up with more responsibility, more demands on us, more desperate circumstances than we feel able to cope with. Why? Because it's only in those kinds of situations where we truly learn to rely on Him. If we only had to face things that we could deal with in our own strength, that we could easily manage without any external help, then why would we need Him? We wouldn't. I think it's pretty fair to say that we all tend to try and do things in our own strength if we possibly can. So yes, God will give you more than you can handle. He will give you more than you know what to do with. You will face times in your life where you feel utterly overwhelmed. And though that sounds a little bit scary on the surface, it's really, really not. Because despite that assurance of difficulties to come, of hard times that seem so much beyond you to come, there's also a promise that God will never, ever, ever leave you alone in any situation that you face. That's how Paul could say later on in the very same chapter that he was hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. Though he certainly felt it at times, he knew that he could endure. He knew that he could keep going because he had learned to fully rely on the God who was always with him, the God who was on his side. So it's only in times like that that we become more aware of how close God really is to us. It's only in those times that, as Paul said, we learn to rely only on him, not on ourselves, not on the people around us, not on the stuff that we've always counted on, but only on him. It's also in those moments when we're forced to rely absolutely on God that we come to a new realization of his power in our lives. See, Paul knew that God could raise the dead. He'd seen it. He knew this. And yet there's a sense here that he was aware of it in an entirely new way when his own life was a threat. We stopped relying on ourselves, he said, and learned to rely only on God who raises the dead. When we reach the end of ourselves and we say, okay, God, you are going to have to step into this situation because I simply cannot do it on my own, then we open the door to the miraculous, to his power at work in our desperation, whatever it may be that we need in that moment. So we need to learn this reliance on God. And often it's only in those situations that are far beyond what we can endure in our own strength that we really do learn this lesson. And it's suddenly a prayer for my own life that I would learn this lesson quickly, so that even in those days of plenty and ease, those good days, that I still rely on him first and foremost, even in the good times. And I hope that it's the same for you. So we will face times that are more than we can handle. But in those moments, we can stop relying on ourselves and, just as Paul did, learn to rely only on God. Thank you so much for joining me here again today for these thoughts from the Bible. I'll be back on Monday with some more, so I will see you then.